We're about to start soon, so please take your seats. Costa, are we live? Okay. A bit of quiet, please. We're making a start. Okay. Kalisperasas. Good evening, everyone. Let me start respectfully acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we gather, the Wurundjeri people of the Eastern Kulin Nation, and pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging. We are committed to our reconciliation journey because at its heart, reconciliation is about strengthening relationships between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples for the benefit of all Victorians. Finally, this moment has arrived. We have returned to our beloved mezzanine level and to some degree of semi-normality and quasi-sociality. A very big welcome to all those who've gathered at the Greek Centre's mezzanine level, and to those who are following us online, in cyberspace, from wherever you may be. Hope you've had an enjoyable summer and are eagerly awaiting the Greek community's cultural and educational programming this year. There's already a multitude of events in the pipeline, so become a member, become a subscriber to the community's newsletter, follow the community on social media to ensure you don't miss out and remain informed about the community's activities. Now let's move to the seminar series and some housekeeping. This is the 12th year of the seminar series. I really don't know where all that time has gone. In this respect, I would like to acknowledge the efforts of some colleagues who have been assisting me over the last decade, to Thea and Costa Marcos, to Dimitra Lagoudaki, Christoula Stamopoulou, to Auntie Elena Yanakopoulou. Thank you for your past support. And furthermore, this series remains in place because you, the members, the aficionados, the bookworms, the history buffs, and the restless souls have supported it. Thank you. Over the last 2 years, the program was transferred online, and we don't want to abandon that format since A, it's given us greater scope for speakers and topics. B, it's created a new audience of people interstate, internationally, and even Melbourne, where the CBD might not be a convenient location. So all events where we have local or sometimes interstate speakers, where they're involved, will be hybrid seminars at the mezzanine level and simultaneously broadcast online. To kickstart the program this year, our first 3 seminars, today's, next week's with Professor Aristotles Karalis, and a panel discussion the week after, all these will be at the mezzanine level. We then convert totally online to online seminars from late March to late April with international speakers, since we also lose the use of the mezzanine due to the Comedy Festival, a lot of good events there as well. From May onwards, it's on and off, hybrid and online in no particular order. All this is outlined in the program that you have at your seats. In such a hybrid setup, Q&A becomes a bit more complex. For those who online, continue to submit your questions to the chat or comment section on Facebook and YouTube. They will be relayed to me, but we may not get to all of them, so apologies. For those asking questions from the floor, please keep them quite simple and short. They cannot be heard from the online audience, so it becomes easy for the speaker to repeat or summarise the question. And just a reminder, we have an information desk at the back of the room. Tonight it's been staffed by Spiridoula Dimitriou, one of our new board members. Introduce yourself to her, and also Mary Rirakis, a long-term attendee at these seminars. There's some new books available for sale, and they're both new membership and renewal forms, and also help yourself to some of the tea and coffee available. Now let's move over to the speaker and tonight's topic, and get the show on the road. Firstly, it would be remiss of me not to mention tonight's sponsor, Joseph Talanidis, and we encourage you all to become a sponsor of a seminar of your choice. It's only a $100 tax-deductible donation. Also, a special thanks to our corporate sponsors, Delphi Bank, Delphi Accounting, and Symposiac Wines for their continued sponsorship. The distinguished scholar with us tonight, who's also participated in our series in the past, is Professor Tim Parkin. He probably needs no introduction to many of you here. He's the inaugural Elizabeth and James Tatoulis Chair in the Classics at the University of Melbourne, was appointed in 2018. Born and raised in New Zealand, he completed his doctorate at the University of Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar and has taught both ancient history and classical languages at universities in his native New Zealand, Australia, Germany, and the UK. His research interests and publications are numerous and include the themes of demography, sexuality, childhood and ageing in the classical world. He is also the Honorary President of the Classical Association of Victoria. Tonight's seminar is a thought-provoking one. Ancient advice on when to marry and have children. These are timeless questions of which we've all pondered at some stage of our lives. And we've probably all thought about how this advice may have changed during the ages as the needs and expectations of society have evolved. And one might ask, marriage advice from the ancients for whom? For the upper classes? For the citizens of the polis? For the slaves? For the resident aliens and the xeni? Does it vary? Initially, I was tempted to research the topic and outline some thoughts in my introduction. But why steal the speaker's thunder? He'll definitely do a better job and be more entertaining than me. So, Professor Parkin, there are many of us here and online who haven't made these decisions. We await with bated breath on the ancient wisdom you're about to convey. Please don't take this presentation lightly, as many will be making real-life and life-changing decisions on what they hear tonight. The floor is yours, and we're honoured to have you back at the Greek Centre.
Aristotle. Thank you, Nick. I feel an enormous weight on my shoulders now that everyone's waiting with bated breath for my advice. As someone who is married, and my wife is here, Ros, thank you, but doesn't have any children, I think you should take my advice with a grain of salt. But it is an enormous pleasure to be here. Congratulations on the 12th year, Nick, and your whole team. My thanks also to the sponsors, Kalisperisas, and thank you all for coming. Those of you who are here in the room and those of you online. It is really wonderful to be here. A good deal has been written on the topic, including by me, on the best age to marry in ancient Greek and Roman times, especially for females, because it really matters in terms of the shape of the population. But nowadays, the question that everyone asks is not what age should we get married, but what age should we start having children? Isn't that a lovely photo? So just a trawl of recent press where the question keeps coming up constantly. What's the right age to have a child? It's a very topical issue, and it has a long history, as we'll see. Sometimes people follow strict patterns. So here's a young woman who has had 3 children, spaced 10 years between them, 18, 28 and 38. Most people are not quite so systematic, it must be said. Sometimes the advice comes from medical practitioners. What is the best age? And so different factors come into play. What's the healthiest age? Other times, the advice, I think, is quite, shall we say, agnostic. 20, 30, 40, it doesn't matter what age you have children. Becoming a parent is the most important thing. Whereas others would say, ladies, this is the New Idea magazine, ladies, this is the best age to marry. Authoritative statements come, but they never tend to agree. Each of these tends to have a different age. Other advice, where you get advice not from the New Idea magazine, but from scientists, where they take into account various things, including levels of fertility, of course, fertility experts. They're big questions. It's not just a light question. They're big questions in terms of the family, but also in terms of the society as a whole. And as we all know, people are tending to have children later in life in Australia. And some very great celebrities, this in the news in the past week, Naomi Campbell becoming a mother at the age of 50. This makes big news. So certainly I think my topic is topical, as we say. It's certainly an important question in Greece as well, where the average age of maternity has been increasing in recent years, which has major demographic effects in the society, and lots of press about this in recent years as well. Having fewer children and starting, because of course the later you start, the fewer children you'll tend to have. This has major demographic repercussions, economic repercussions. So they're questions of importance not just to families, but also to politicians, just as they were 2 millennia or more ago as well. Big questions in Greece and big questions in Australia as well. So let's go back in time, because once I started researching this question, I realised that no one has actually asked the question in antiquity. What did they regard as the best age to have children? Lots of discussion about the best age to get married, not about the best age to have children, although there's a lot of ancient discussion about the best age to get your cattle, to get your sheep and goats starting to have children, but not about human beings. So I thought it's a vital question, pun intended, a really vital, important question in terms of understanding populations. What was different, what was similar, what were attitudes like 2,500 years ago? So interesting questions. Now, it's not actually the first time I've thought about this. When I was in the UK, so here is an ancient couple thinking about having children. This is a wonderful depiction from Pompeii of a husband and wife thinking about something, possibly, shall we start having children? The question first occurred to me in an ancient context about 5 years ago when I was still in the UK, and every year at Cambridge University they have a big festival of ideas, and I was invited for a couple of years in a row to attend a debate on a topical issue. They would invite, so in this was 6 years ago, the question was, is 20 years old too young to have a baby? That was the question. And they invited for the debate a politician, a sociologist, a media star, and 2 historians. I was the ancient one, there was a modern one as well. I was the only male, by the way, in the panel. It led to a very heated debate, especially with the audience. Although not as heated as the one the next year, which was on breastfeeding, and again, I was the only male. Should women only breastfeed their own babies, was the question. So I brought an ancient perspective to that, which again caused quite a storm. Anyway, the range of modern answers that we got to the best age to start having children, that we got from our politician, sociologist, media star, and modern historian, as well as from most of the audience, was between the ages of 25 and 40. Whereas I, as the last speaker and the one male, said, is 20 years too young to have a baby? 20 years is too old to have a baby, from the ancient perspective, which at least got my audience's attention. Everyone in the 21st century has an opinion on this. If you're an ambitious grandparent, then you want your children to start as soon as possible. If you're the couple themselves, then perhaps you might put it off for a few years. But what was the answer in antiquity? 20 years is too old for a female to start having children, according to some ancient writers. And it's, again, Nick asked a very perceptive question. Who's the audience, or who is asking the question? And of course, we tend to be getting the perspectives from the ancient world of philosophers and politicians. And to be honest, if I wanted to know the best age to have a child in the 21st century, the last person I would ask would be a politician. But there you go. We ask from antiquity who we can. Augustus, speaking of politicians, Augustus passed legislation over 2 millennia ago requiring men to marry and have children by the time they turned 25 years of age. Women by the age of 20 years. Augustus was motivated, it would seem, and at least in part, by perceived dire demographic circumstances, not unlike some of the circumstances we're seeing in the 21st century, the need to increase the birth rate. So we are talking in this case not necessarily of the best age, but of the most necessary age, the necessities of the time. The apparent linking together of the age of marriage and the age of childbearing was remarked upon by at least one person in antiquity. At the end of the 2nd century, Tertullian, in his Apology, went so far as to remark on, and I quote, those absolutely stupid Augustan laws which require people to have children at an earlier age than the laws require them to be married, which made no sense in antiquity at all. Speaking of philosophers, Aristotle has a lot to say. We'll come back to him because he's a bit weird in this context at least. So I shall leave him for the end. He was certainly not the first to ask the question. There are 11 11 immortal lines from the poet Hesiod, breaking news, 11 immortal lines from the poet Hesiod, writing in the 8th or 7th century BC, addressed to his brother. The first lines I found that really ask the question, what's the best age to get married at least? And this is the advice he gives to his brother. Bring home a wife to your house when you are of the right age, while you are not far short of 30 years, nor much above. This is the right age for marriage. Let your wife have grown up 4 years, so 4 years after the age of puberty is what he means. Let your wife have grown up 4 years and marry her in the 5th, so when she's 19. Marry a virgin so that you can teach her careful ways, and especially marry one who lives near you. But look well about you and see that your marriage will not be a joke to your neighbours. For a man wins nothing better than a good wife, and again, nothing worse than a bad one. A greedy soul. The Greek word is actually dinner ambusher, someone who ambushes your dinner. A greedy soul who roasts her man without fire. Isn't that wonderful? Strong though he may be, and brings him to a raw old age. Isn't that great? I mean, I'm not agreeing with them, but they're great lines. So the best age is for a man to be about 30, plus or minus, and for his wife, a virgin wife, of 18 or 19. Females should marry young and start, we're talking about first marriage, start reproducing as soon as possible. So basically to Hesiod, he makes the assumption the age of marriage is 9 months later, the age of producing your first child. So women in the Greek world and in the Roman world as well were expected to marry young. The age difference in age was, in Hesiod's case, we're talking about 12 years. That would be absolutely normal. To marry someone the same age as you would be regarded as a little strange. For a man to marry a woman older than him would be positively kinky, I would say, in the ancient world. But it means that women were married young. There's a close-up. You can see there perceived difference of age between, I think, between the husband and the wife in that Roman case. Wonderful example. Often you'll see this described in books as a mother with her baby, but it's not. It's a grandmother with her grandchild. And the inscription shows that. And it's very sad. I am holding this dear child of my daughter, whom I held on my lap while we were alive and looked at the light of the sun. Now I, who am dead, am holding this dead child. High mortality levels, high infant mortality levels. Basically, this woman, Amphitrite, probably became a mother at the age of 14, 15, 16, and her daughter in turn became a mother too. So Amphitrite here is probably only in her late 30s, early 40s, as she's being depicted. We know this from legal texts as well. The Gorton Code from Crete, 5th century BC, recommends that young girls should be married in their 12th year or older, especially if they've inherited property. And often that's part of the consideration. Pseudo-Aristotle in his Constitution of Athens says similarly that in Athens, young females with property would normally marry about the age of 14. And clearly what comes through in our sources, Greek and Roman, is that the elite classes, the upper classes, were marrying especially young. You would expect to marry your daughter off before she turned 14. Xenophon, the Greek historian, great Greek writer, in his Oikonomicus on how to run the household, has the fictional character Ischomachus talk about his 14-year-old bride. And this is what he says. He's very proud of bringing this young lady into his house. What could she have known when I married her, since she wasn't yet 15 years old when she came to me, and he was in his, I think, 28 or 29. When I married her, since she wasn't yet 15 years of age when she came to me. And in the time before she had lived such a protected life, that she saw and heard as little as possible and asked the fewest questions. She came to me quite knowledgeable about food, though, a matter that seems to me important for both men and women to know about. I can't help thinking Ischomachus was not the best husband in the world. Plato in his laws would have females marry between the ages of 15 and 19, Aristotle, in his Politics, has females marry at 18, but we'll come back to that because I think there's more to say. In all of this, it was important that the bride be a virgin. And Plutarch, writing in the 2nd century, in his comparison of the lives of Lycurgus and King Numa, makes much of the fact that in Sparta, girls married and started to bear children at what by his standards was a relatively old age as compared to Rome. And I'll quote, Lycurgus, the great Spartan lawgiver, made Spartan girls brides only when they were fully ripe and eager for it, in order that intercourse with a husband, coming at a time when nature craved it, might produce a kindly love, instead of the timorous hate that follows unnatural compulsion. Also that the bodies might be vigorous enough to endure the strain of conception and childbirth, convinced as he was that marriage had no other end than the production of children. The Romans, on the other hand, gave their maidens, their virgins in marriage when they were 12 years old or even younger. In this way, more than any other, it was thought that both their bodies and their dispositions would be pure and undefiled when their husbands took control of them. It's chilling, actually quite chilling words. It is clear, therefore, that one practice regarded nature more with children in view, the other regarded more the formation of character with married life in view. Isn't that an interesting perspective? It's not just, by the way, about ensuring that the wife is a virgin when she's married so any children will be legitimate. It's also, allegedly, for their own health and welfare. And this is even more chilling. From Hippocrates, talking about the illnesses that affect young females. Unmarried young women, when they first begin to menstruate, become delirious, fearful of the dark, and subject to visions which bid them either to throw themselves down wells and drown, or else hang themselves, possibly because they've seen their future husbands, I'm not sure. Release comes when the menstrual blood cannot properly flow, and this happens after sexual intercourse. So we get in Hippocrates, we get this in other medical writers, that for many gynecological complaints of younger females, especially at the onset of menstruation, that sexual intercourse is the best cure. Parthenoi, virgins, should sleep with a man as soon as possible, says Hippocrates, when they experience these symptoms. If they become pregnant, they will be cured. If not, then at puberty or shortly afterwards, they will succumb to the illness. So we are very much getting the male perspective on things. And I'm not suggesting that this is necessarily the reality. I do really believe that in classical Greece especially, knowledge passed down from mothers to daughters meant that the reality was somewhat less chilling and somewhat less frightening than all of this. But certainly the male medical sources are clear on this. And to quote one modern scholar of the Greek world, the early age of marriage for Greek women is likely to have been determined by an unhappy mixture of sexual politics, male pride, and medical ignorance. And even more true, I would argue, for the age at which a woman should have her first child. Evidence suggests that mid-teen first marriage for female citizens was the norm for both Athens and Rome in antiquity. Difference between endogamous practices: in Athens you would tend to marry cousins, in Rome you would tend to marry outside of distant kin. Females in antiquity, their first marriage typically took place in the mid to late teens. Mid-teens in the case of the upper classes, late teens in the lower classes, mainly for economic reasons. In Rome, the legal minimum age for marriage for a female was 12, but it didn't mean marriage before that age was illegal. It just wasn't recognised by the law until the woman turned 12. Brides on average would be 10 to 15 years younger than their husbands, sometimes much younger. Here's another example, famous example, from the British Museum, originally from Rome, but somehow it's ended up in the British Museum, but we won't go there, not today. This is the tombstone of a butcher and his wife, and I'm very fond of it because it's not an elite tombstone. They've spent a lot of money on it, and I think they do think that they're better than the average person, but he is certainly seems proud of his wife. So we have the husband and wife being depicted. She is called Philematium, little kiss, and you can actually see, normally in these sorts of depictions you see husband and wife clasping hands, the joining of the right hands is a symbol of marriage, but she's actually kissing his hand because I think it symbolises her name, Philematium, little kiss. And whatever we might think of him, he certainly expresses his fondness for his wife. So on one side we have a statement from him, excuse me, we can fill in the broken bit there. One side we have a statement from him, on the other side a statement from her. We'll start with his statement. His name is Lucius Aemilius Hermia, freedman of Lucius. So he used to be a slave. He's been set free. He's got the 3 names of a Roman citizen. His slave name would have been Hermia. His master's name was Lucius Aurelius something. So he's become Lucius Aurelius Hermia. He's a butcher on the Viminal Hill in Rome. She who preceded me in death was my one and only wife, chaste in body, with a loving spirit. She lived faithful to her faithful husband, always optimistic, even in bitter times. She never shirked her duties. He doesn't actually say that he loved her, but one hopes that that's to be implicit. And then we move to the other side, a statement that he has written on her behalf. Aurelia Philematium, freed woman of Lucius, was called Aurelia Philematium, so the Latin form of the Greek name Philemation, little kiss, while alive, a woman chaste and modest, unsoiled by the common crowd. I love that. She's the wife of a butcher, but she's better than the common crowd. Faithful to my husband, whom alas I'm now without, was a fellow freedman. So they would have been slaves together in a household, and they were given their freedom. And clearly at some point they have become a couple. Whether the master decided that they should cohabit or whatever, we don't know. He was really and truly like a father to me, which is such a telling comment. When I was 7 years old, he embraced me. The Greek is, he recapit gremio, he received me into his lap, which might mean he protected me, or it might be a more sexual relationship, but certainly they became husband and wife at some point. Now I am 40 years old and in the power of death. Through my constant care, my husband flourished. You notice how it tends to be mainly about him, don't you? But, so here is, we don't know his age, but clearly the age difference between them, he was like a father to me. This is going down the lower classes, this is not a, you could say, a natural relationship in that it might have been set up by a master or something. But whatever you think about the expressions that he makes, it's a couple where the age difference is taken for granted, I suspect, apart from many other things. Okay. So let's think about men briefly. Remember Hesiod's advice, the man should be about 30 when he marries for the first time. Solon, the great Athenian lawgiver in the beginning of the 6th century, recommended that men marry and procreate between the ages of 28 and 34, because that's the 5th hebdomad. He divided life up into 10 stages of 7 years, and in those 7 years you should marry and procreate. In your later years you should start doing more intellectual things. But the age between 28 and 34, not inconsistent with Hesiod. Plato provides us with some figures for the desirable ages in the different systems that he has for citizens to marry. In the Republic, referring to the prime of life, physically and mentally, for each gender, he states that a woman should produce children for the state from her 20th to her 40th year, and a man from his 25th to his 55th year, not unlike what Augustus would do half a millennium later. With the peak time for marriage for a man being in his 30th year, again that age, 30, as with Hesiod. In Plato's Laws, where he becomes slightly more autocratic, shall we say, a male is required to marry between the ages of 25 or 30 and 35. A woman is so required between the ages of 16 and 20 years. And a couple should usually only reproduce for a period of 10 years. I don't know what happens if you go beyond that, but in Plato's Laws it would be quite strict. So we're getting shades of Augustus, and the reason I'm doing this is to make it sound like there's a normal pattern, and I think there was. about 30 for a male, about 15 to 18 for a female. This is because I want to bring us to Aristotle quite quickly. The most explicit ancient statement regarding the best age for both citizen males and females, not just to marry but also to procreate, comes from Aristotle, who was incidentally fond of quoting both Hesiod and Solon, so he knew his ancient sources. He would have known what they had said as well as what Plato had said. In his Politics, Book 7, he provides a lengthy answer, and I'm actually going to quote the whole thing to you because it's extremely readable, I think, and extremely interesting, because I think there's more to Aristotle's statement than meets the eye. I want to talk about his motivations. So here's the Greek. It is a lengthy passage, but trust me, I think you'll find it interesting. I'll quote it to you in English. This is Benjamin Jowett's translation. And I quote. Follow it through with me, please, because I think, given the background I've given you, it's easy to follow and quite interesting, I think. Since the legislator should begin by considering how the frames of the children whom he is rearing may be as good as possible, his first care will be about the union of the sexes. At what age should his citizens marry, and who are fit to marry? In legislating on this subject, he ought to consider the persons and their relative ages, that there may be no disproportion in them, and that they may not differ in their bodily powers. As will be the case if the man is still able to beget children while the woman is unable to bear them, or the woman able to bear while the man is unable to beget. For from these causes arise quarrels and differences between married persons. So he's worried about people being happy in their marriage. Secondly, the legislator must consider the time at which the children will succeed to their parents. There ought not to be too great an interval of age, for then the parents will be too old to derive any pleasure from their affection or to be of any use to them. Nor ought they be too nearly of an age, too young. To youthful marriages there are many objections. The children will be wanting in respect to their parents, who will seem to be their contemporaries. Don't marry too young. And disputes will arise in the management of the household. Thirdly, the legislator must mould to his will the frames of newly born children. Almost all these objects may be secured by attention to one point. Since the time of generation is commonly limited within the age of 70 years in the case of a man and of 50 years in the case of a woman, the commencement of the union should conform to those periods. It's getting quite complicated, but it's going to come down to a fairly simple fact in a minute. The union of male and female when too young is bad for the procreation of children. In all other animals, the offspring of the young are small and ill-developed, and generally of the female sex. And therefore also in man, as is proved by the fact that in those cities to which men and women are accustomed to engage in intercourse at a young age, the people are small and weak. In childbirth also, younger women suffer more, and more of them die. Some persons say that this was the meaning of the response once given by the oracle to the Troezenians, "Share not the young field." The oracle really meant that many died because they married too young. It had nothing to do with the gathering in of the harvest. It is also conducive to temperance not to marry too soon. For women who engage in intercourse early are apt to be wanton. Jowett's translation. And in men too, the bodily frame is stunted if they have intercourse while they are growing, for there is a time when the growth of the body ceases. Women should marry when they are about 18 years of age. He finally comes down to the equation. Women should marry when they're about 18 years of age, and men at 37. Men at 37, which is a shock. I hear the gasps in the room. Then they're in the prime of life for intercourse, and the decline in the powers of both will coincide. Further, the children, if their birth takes place at that time, if the birth takes place at the time that may reasonably be expected, that is shortly after the marriage, will succeed in their prime, when the fathers are already in the decline of life and have nearly reached their term of 70 years. This then, he finishes, is what needs to be said about the proper age for the union of the sexes. Now, this has puzzled people for 2 millennia ever since, because he ignores the advice and normal practice in his own society. So I want to suggest what's actually going on here, if I can find the right place. It's pretty clear that Aristotle, to his credit, is taking into account a range of factors. Not just biological, but also social and economic. The biological is to the fore, certainly. It is physically harmful, he says, for a male who is still not at full maturity to have sex. It's not clear whether he means harmful for the seed or for the body. Probably he means the seed. The seed will not be strong enough and will produce weak children. Both father and mother should be in good physical condition, comparable to each other. The inference is that both should be able to fulfill the role of parent to the best of their ability, as well as to produce a healthy offspring, so that in time, when the child grows and reaches maturity, the parent should not be too old. Hence, parents should not be too young either. Okay, but it's still not fully persuasive. When he becomes so precise in terms of age, and what's so striking, especially to a modern reader, is that while Aristotle believes that there should be no disproportion between husband and wife, this does not mean that they should be of roughly the same age. Far from it. The difference in age between the two should be significant. According to Aristotle, males can reproduce to the age of 70, while females cease to be reproductive at 50. So a difference in age of 20 years between husband and wife is highly desirable in order that they grow old together at comparable stages. So not only do not marry too young, but maintain a healthy age gap between yourself and your spouse so that the decline in the powers of you both will coincide. The husband should be 37, the wife should be 18. What really started making me wonder about this was not just it doesn't seem normal, but also 37 is a really strange age to pick. It's odd. It's not just an odd number, it's a prime number. Normally you choose a number like 27, 3 times 9, or 30, a round number, 42, 6 times 7. 37, there's nothing magical, there's nothing special about it. So why did he choose that age? What's even stranger is that in another work, he says that human growth ceases at the age of 30, not at 37. Benjamin Jowett himself, there's the wonderful gentleman, clearly worried about this himself too by that picture, put it this way: the disparity of age between the man and the woman appears to be great, but as Aristotle extends the term for the woman from 18 to 50, and for the men from 35 to 70, the time allowed for cohabitation in either would nearly coincide, that is 35 and 32 years. There is therefore no reason to doubt that the textual reading is correct. Jowett, who never married himself. But, the demographer, the great demographer, his work on population, Thomas Malthus, in the 18th and 19th centuries, an essay on the principle of population, made the necessary, though fairly obvious observation that such a gap of over 20 years would condemn a great number of women to celibacy, given that there will never be enough men of 37 to match women of 18 years of age. And that's a true, important observation as well. So what's going on? Aristotle himself, in his History of Animals, Book 7, if indeed that is by Aristotle, I think it is, shows no indication of the desirability there, where he's talking about age difference between husband and wife, the desirability of it being so extended. And that's because I think there he's only thinking of biological factors, general rules. Here it's somewhat different. In his rhetoric, in his work, Aristotle wrote so much, in his rhetoric, in a very different context, he distinguishes between physical and mental peaks of males and females. He says the male is at his best physically from 30 to 35, but mentally at the age of about 49. That is 7 times 7. Very lucky number. Now, I worked out exactly when Aristotle wrote that. Aristotle would have been 49 years of age when he wrote that. He returned to Athens in 335 BC, and at that point he completed the rhetoric. Now, I think that's a clue to what's going on 12 years earlier, shall we say. You can see where this is heading. Aristotle turned 37 years of age in 347 BC, the year in which he left Athens after some 20 years of residence. It may be that his departure was due to the way that Speusippus, Plato's nephew and successor in charge of the academy, was running things, or perhaps more likely through Aristotle's fear of anti-Macedonian sentiments in Athens. In any case, he travelled to the court of a former fellow student in the academy, Hermias in the Troad in Asia Minor, and there we are told Aristotle married for the first and only time, the woman Pythias, who was either Hermias's adoptive daughter or his niece, or possibly both, actually. Pythias bore Aristotle a daughter, whom they also named Pythias. A few years later, shortly after his father-in-law Hermias' death in 345, Aristotle took up Philip II of Macedon's invitation to come to Pella to become the tutor of the young Alexander. So Aristotle married only once at the age of 37 or 38 years. As far as I know, we don't know how old Pythias, his bride, was, but it is very tempting to surmise that she may have been 18 years of age. We know that she died young, after about a decade of marriage, and Aristotle never remarried. He lived with a slave woman by whom he had a son, Nicomachus, after whom his more famous book of Ethics is named. So I would argue, and I'm surprised no one's ever noticed this before, Aristotle's statement in the Politics is not talking about wide Athenian or ancient practice. It's talking about personal experience. That a man should marry and procreate at age 37 with an 18-year-old wife was simply a reflection of what he himself did in 347. Some may see such an equation as too flippant or trivial for a serious-minded philosopher, but I'm not so sure. In fact, the great French philosopher Montaigne, I think, was already on to what was going on. Montaigne expressed his approval of Aristotle's 20-year age gap, but he said that Aristotle at the time was 35. Montaigne at the time that he got married was 35 to a much younger bride. Of course, this prompts the question as to exactly when the Politics was written, and we simply don't know, but there is plentiful evidence that it was written shortly after, or begun at least. It was written over a long period, begun at least shortly after his marriage at this time when he first moved back to Athens. I can't prove my case, but it seems to me extremely likely, just to round up. To the question, what is the best age to have children? The basic ancient answer was that people should marry and have children, females should marry and have children as young as possible and have as many children as possible for the state. That assumption leads one to imagine the social pressures put upon a newlywed couple, by family as well as by the state, laws aside, to produce children in a timely fashion following the wedding. In terms of family planning, this assumption also perhaps tells us something about ancient practices and expectations, slight at most, regarding the efficacy of contraceptive methods. But what I can also say to conclude is that Aristotle's advice in the Politics on the desirability of a 20-year age gap between husband and wife was not much followed except by Aristotle himself. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim, for that entertaining seminar, and I'm sure there'll be quite a few questions from the audience, but I might just sort of kickstart things off. You also studied demography in antiquity. In antiquity, I've read that the average life expectancy was around sort of high 30s, 40 or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So isn't 37 a bit too late?
No.
But at the same time, maybe because you had very high, sort of, let's say, child mortality, it was probably much higher. So.
Yeah. Aristotle himself lived to be 63, and that was regarded as dying relatively young. So the point is, you're absolutely right, infant mortality levels were extremely high.
So they bring the average down.
Yeah, so you can imagine that, to put it in harsh terms, probably only, trying to think at the top of my head, but the chance of you living to your first birthday is about 1 in 4 in the ancient world. It's really harsh, but if you live to 10, then chances are you're going to go on to live to be 60, 70, 80. So the biblical 70 years and 10 wasn't regarded as an extremely old age, it was regarded as a appropriate lifespan. To die younger than 70 was to die young. So at 37, Aristotle could say, I'm at the prime of life, could expect to have another good 33 years in front of him. But many of the people born in the same year as him did not live beyond the first few years of life. That's the reality, demographic realities. So when we say life expectancy at birth in the ancient world was 25, 30 years, very few people drop dead at 25 or 30. I always explain this to my students because they all go quite pale at this and think of the realities of, I've only got 5 years to live or something. No. If you've lived to 20, you're building up immunity as well. So, you could expect to live. And we know genuine cases of people living well beyond 100 in the ancient world, but you would have felt quite alone of your generation, I think.
Phil?
Thank you. That was a great talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
I just want to touch on your theme of...
Just repeat Phil's question.
Yep.
Okay. Oh, I've got a fairly long question, so I'm sorry. The theme of self-justification here that seemed to attribute to Aristotle. A long time ago I had a radio program and I was asking a doctor about how many coffees is it good to drink? How many should you drink a day? And I can have one and that's it. He said, I think 5 to 7. And I said, oh, really? Is that you can drink 5 to 7 coffees? And I said, how many do you drink? 5 to 7. So self-justification, is that right? Is that what we're getting from you from this? Is that perhaps he is saying, I'm married at that age, therefore I am right?
Well, I mean, so how can I sum up that question? Is it self-justification? Is Aristotle basically saying, because this is what I've done, therefore I'm right? So rather than do what I say, not what I do, he's saying do what I do because it's the right thing. In many of his other works, he gives contrary advice to this. So, we all learn from our experience, I suppose you could say. But I think here, I can't help that he's got a bit of a wry grin as he's writing it, if you can imagine Aristotle grinning. I don't know. But I think most ancient readers, to be honest, as with Jowett, would look at 37 and think that's really weird, what's going on here. And I think they would Aristotle might almost expect the reader to pick up on this hint, which is why I'm surprised that no one has picked up on this before. It could be because I'm wrong, of course. But, so no, I don't think he's saying self-justification. I think it's more, as a professor, I like to put the occasional bit of humour into my lectures as well. So maybe this is a piece of humour in the politics. I wouldn't want to push that one too far, because it's not a barrel of laughs, the politics, it must be said.
And I think you also mentioned that actually there was quite a significant difference between the life expectancy of men and women. So is that another reason for that larger age gap?
Well, I wasn't saying that, although I think it's true. I mean, we're used to, in the modern world, women living longer than men. I think in the ancient, and by nature that is how things normally work. But I think in the ancient world, because of different practices, women tended to have slightly shorter life expectancy. But this isn't about life expectancy, this is about the reproductive capacity. And so in a demographic regime, to use demographic terms, where you've got to maximise fertility, you want females to start reproducing young and to reproduce throughout the reproductive period. We now know that the earlier a woman starts reproducing, it doesn't tend to extend the reproductive span, so it will finish earlier as well. But it really is a case of maximising the reproductive span. So there's a lot of discussion in the ancient sources by men about female reproductivity in that sense.
There's been a question. I'll get to you. There's been a question from the online audience from Nikos Papasadiadis. Is one of the reasons for that age difference also to minimise any rivalry between the parent and the child?
I like Aristotle's view that if you start having children too young, they'll start treating you as fellow teenagers or something like that, and you don't want that. There is a tension in societies, especially a patriarchal society, where the father holds a lot of power, and this is true of Roman society especially. Pater familias until his death owns everything. And so once your son is reaching, or your daughter is reaching, adulthood and wanting some independence, some financial independence, etc. So, if the father is becoming very old and feeble and not running the house well, then the family tensions there would be extreme, I would have thought. So getting that, and that's really why I say Aristotle does a really good job of thinking of a range of variables, not just the biological, because he's thinking about tensions within the house. He's thinking about the family being the absolute basis of society. We want that family to be happy, that oikos to be happy. And so let's not cause problems between husband and wife. If there's a 20-year gap, apparently they'll be very happy. But the children not being too young or too old as a result of that. So, of course, it's not a mathematical equation, but we could think about it.
Thank you, Tim. That was a fantastically entertaining chat. I'm just curious about one aspect. Are we tending to get, from the literary sources, of course, the perspective of an educated elite when they talk about a 70-year lifespan, points to marry, when you sort of counterpoise that against how intensely warlike the Greek city-states were and the warrior responsibilities of a Roman as well. Many men died, obviously, very, very young.
Yep.
So to think that they would wait till 30 or, God forbid, 37 to get married, when many of them may have fallen in their early 20s on the battlefield, does it suggest that for the common people, they were marrying at different points than, say, an educated elite class?
Really good question, John, thank you. And one thing I had to leave out, because I saw that I was running over time already, was that I had a couple of pages discussing what evidence we have for the lower classes, because I'm much more interested in lower classes. We get lots of tombstones, especially from the Roman world. I just mentioned the Romans and instantly. For the Roman world, where you're again getting the same age gaps, you're again getting 10 to 15 years. So it's not that men weren't having sexual relationships before marriage. They were expected to. Women were certainly expected, young women were certainly expected to enter the marriages as virgins in the Greek and the Roman world. In the Greek and Roman world, men were not. Men were fully expected to be having sex, to be reproducing illegitimate children, etc., as long as it wasn't with unmarried daughters in other parts of the household. So, it's not that you have to lead a celibate life until you're 30 by any means. But yes, I mean, in demographic terms, I think the toll of maternity was significant, obviously much more significant than it is today, maternal mortality, counterbalanced to a certain extent by the dangers of being a young man in certain periods of Greek and Roman history. But for most people in the Roman world, for example, the risks of dying in battle were minimal, unless you wanted to make a career as a soldier and you had a particularly incompetent general, I guess.
Tim, can you all hear me? Yeah. If Aristotle is proposing a 20-year sort of age difference, that would make the husband the same age as the mother-in-law. What would be the implication on family dynamics?
I think you're onto something, Nick. Aristotle didn't think through that. I'm trying to think of his mother-in-law. I don't think we hear about his mother-in-law at all. But we know that when his wife died, he then took up with a slave woman. He decided not to remarry. So maybe, politics version 2, he would say, everything I wrote about the 20-year gap, although, it was my experience, there are a few footnotes I'd like to add to that. I don't know. Excellent question, Nick. But perhaps he chose a young bride who didn't have a mother. I don't know.
Any further questions? I'll take one last one before we close proceedings. No? Okay. Tim, thank you very much. It was great sort of having you back again. And I'm sure you won't disappear, and we'll have you back in some future events. Just a small gift from a great community.
Thank you very
I'm
much.
sure you need that after this seminar tonight. So thanks
It's
once again.
Aristotle.
A big
Thank
round
you.
of applause, everyone. Don't forget, next week we have Professor Vrasidas Karanis from the University of Sydney talking about the music of Mikis Theodorakis. I hope to see you next week, and help yourself some coffee tea at the back and have a look at some of our books. Thank you for coming tonight. Much appreciated.
Thanks, Nick. So when I saw you arriving there, I thought I've gone over time. Sorry.